50 years of repression, the Christian church in China is now one of the most vibrant religious movements in the world. According to the China Christian Council, 3 new churches are opening every 2 days, and last year they celebrated 400,000 adult baptisms. 3 members of the United Methodist Church's Northern Illinois Conference visited China in October to witness firsthand this faith phenomenon. We welcome Sally Dick, Bishop of the Northern Illinois Conference. We also welcome Reverend Phil Blackwell, Senior Pastor of First United Methodist Church, Chicago Temple, and Reverend Arlene Christofferson, Assistant to the Bishop. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. So how did this whole China trip start out?
Well, in 2010, we hosted a Bible exhibition that was sponsored by the China Christian Council. It traveled to 4 cities across the United States, and because of a previous relationship that our former bishop, Bishop He Su-jung, had with the Chinese church, they found Chicago to be a place that was hospitable. Reverend Blackwell offered the Chicago Temple as a site for the Bible exhibition, and we spent 15 days with a delegation from China while they shared their stories with us. As a gift to us following that work, they asked us to come and learn more about them and visit China firsthand.
Oh, great. So what were some of the things that you that were kind of key components of your trip?
Well, one was to go actually to the Bible publishing house, since that was the display that they brought to us. And they are in the month of November of 2012 producing their 100 millionth copy of the Bible in China. So for all of us good Christians who are trying to smuggle Bibles into China, we can stop that now. They have their own. Now, it was really fascinating to see the proliferation of the word being published and being produced in so many new ways.
They also wanted us to be able to see the church, to see what is really happening in China with Christianity. It's still a very small fraction of the total population, which is huge. And you get a sense of that just being in the major cities. And, but they wanted us to experience it because what we hear about Christianity in China is really quite different from what we experienced.
Bishop Dick, you were newly minted as the Bishop of the Northern Illinois Conference, and so you kind of, I think it was either just before you had moved to Chicago or just after that you ended up making your way over with the other cast of characters here. And so I'm kind of curious for all of you, but maybe beginning with you in particular, what your experience, or maybe if there were some memorable experiences that you had while you were over there.
Well, again, because the church is growing so fast, it was very interesting to see how it is that these churches have come out of a period of time when Christianity really was underground and smaller, and how it has really grown over the last decade or so. And I think also for myself, one of the memorable aspects of it was we went to visit one of the Bible schools, and coming across the yard, who was the head of this school, was somebody that I knew from some other work in the life of the church. And it just reminded me again of how the church really is global, and how it so widens our world if we let it. And so just to witness and to experience her story, her family was, her parents were communists and belonged to the party and really looked down on religion, suspicious of religion. But she saw that people's lives were being changed when the church began to open. And so she became a Christian. But that put her in tension with her family until close to the end of her life, when she was able to reconcile with them. And so just to hear their witnesses and how it changes their lives, and to be reminded once again of just this global church that we live in.
The church there that we saw is basically a first-generation church, because again, after 50 years of the church being illegal, now that it has reemerged, it's a whole new population. So many of the people who are in the congregations are young adults. Most of the clergy are quite young, probably more female than male in the number of clergy. And so it's a new start after 50 years of being underground. And there are still churches and congregations that are underground because they don't trust the arrangement that now has been worked with the government. But what we saw through the China Christian Council was pretty much this new church emerging. And for me, it reminded us, even those of us who have been around in the United States for a long time, that we also are first-generation churches. That everything is urgent and right before us, and we got to get to work.
So I would say one of the stories that was impressive for me was walking into the courtyard of a church on Sunday morning where there were maybe at that point 100 people waiting outside while the very first service was going on, and an overflow crowd was sitting in the courtyard on little stools. And the sanctuary was packed, and they had to hold people back so that one service could finish before another flood of people came in, and an equally large number of people filled the sanctuary. It was for us like a Christmas or Easter morning worship where everyone would be attending. And this one little church in downtown Beijing has about 4,000 people flow through it every week in 4 services, and they have to make sure that they preach the same sermon from 1 hour to the next, or people don't want to leave their seat. They're so hungry to have the gospel, so anxious to hear a pastor and be part of the music and the choir, that the church is gripping people's hearts. And it was moving to see that kind of hunger and excitement for learning and faith.
People recognize that it's changing lives. You know, sometimes we may enjoy the music, or we are experiencing the salvation of Jesus Christ, but often when we'd ask people about what made you go to the church, I mean, after all this suspicion and fear of it, really, they would say, well, because I saw people who were different. Their lives were more compassionate. They were more loving and forgiving than I had known them to be. And that we heard over and over again. Lives are being changed, and changed in the sense of just being a more accepting, loving, caring people.
Well, one of the things that when we went to talk to the government agents who oversee religious life in China, which is part of the concern or controversy or arrangement, I asked the young woman sitting next to me if she had a religious tradition. She says, no, I'm a communist, I'm an atheist, but I am part of protecting religion in China. So, well, okay, what is in it for you as the government? And they said very much what you were just saying, that it's the social services, taking care of the elderly, working on social problems, not so much politicizing them, at least not in this generation. But so I asked her, well, what happens when there's a conflict between the vision of the gospel and the government? And she was confused by that. And I said, well, they're not exactly the same thing. So we got talking about when do religious institutions conform to the law? And she used the example of Mormons not practicing polygamy in the United States. And I said, well, there's also Christian Scientists who have to make some concession around medical laws and expectations. But I said, what happens when the government is acting irresponsibly? And she looked genuinely puzzled and said, that is too abstract for me to understand. Give me an example. So I talked about the Civil Rights Movement and the 50th anniversary in 2013 about the March on Washington, and that seemed to be off her chart. So there are going to be some interesting conversations coming up in the second generation and the third generation. But right now, it seems to me the churches are very concerned about staying focused on the gospel and teaching, and then doing the social services that are related to caring for one another and for the general population.
I want to add, though, that I also think that the church of 50 years ago was a church that sacrificed itself for their faith. We met a pastor who was in his 80s, who had been ordained around 1953 and refused to renounce his faith. And so he went to a labor camp where he served in hard labor until the late 80s. In the midst of that, he continued to profess his faith, to share as a Christian with the people that he met there. and became something, they tell us, of an expert in planting rice, so that even today farmers come to him for advice on their rice fields. But he came back into the church in the early 90s and started again to preach and share the word. And I think there were people who did sacrifice themselves for their faith at a time when speaking out in that way took a risk that we just don't understand in the West.
So folks like that who have this legacy of sort of civil disobedience to some degree, are they welcomed into the fold of the church? Are they, do they stand more on the margins in terms of where the church is growing and the kind of folks who are in leadership at the forefront of that?
This gentleman was revered as the sage of that congregation, and when we went to dinner with him, he ate tripe. We all ate tripe. It was a way of showing honor, and there's a sense of great appreciation within the church, but it also, again, I'm saying there's a big generational shift, and part of the attraction of the church, I suspect, is that it is international. And even Western in the eyes of a lot of the young people in China. When we looked at young people in China just on the street or at various sites.
Could have been downtown Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, they're all dressed very very Western, modern.
Everybody wore skinny jeans.
Yeah, very fashion conscious.
But most people were skinny too, so I mean, they get away with it. No tattoos, no piercings. But everything else was really a kind of international fashion. So again, it's interesting. It would be interesting to figure out, what do the people in their teens and 20s imagine Christianity to be as it relates to their sense of where they locate themselves? Because there's a lot of sort of dislocation with a new economy and new businesses and a lot of emphasis on education.
And a migration throughout the country. I mean, people from the far west coming to the cities on the eastern side and away from their families. And you know, that's one of the things that the church is having to struggle with. And actually, the one thing they were interested in terms of what we do, and that is what we might call more of the social service aspect. When you think about a generation or two now where there's just been one child, and if there's and with the mobility within the country, who's taking care of these elderly parents? And so that becomes increasingly a problem in the sense that there's this long traditions and revering of the elderly, and yet a generation that can't really care for them. And so, you know, they look to the church to do that as well.
We heard some informal conversation about the one child per family impact and how much pressure it puts on young people these days. And so there's a great deal of self-absorption, we are told, among that young population. So the Christian gospel over against the self-absorption has got to be playing a very important role of you know, how do we live out our lives, or how does that population
learning to care for others and get along with others like you do in a family of multiple children. The church helps you with those siblings in the faith, the siblings that teach you those kinds of habits and attitudes.
We visited the Minity Foundation, which just celebrated its 25th anniversary. So it was established just as religion was beginning to be welcomed back. Supported by the World Council of Churches, by the United Methodist Church, by many denominations. It covers, I don't know if they said 25 different departments, including ministries to AIDS, HIV victims, disaster response, English training, medical, rural training, and equipping. So they've really stepped into roles that the Chinese government hasn't figured out how to manage. And with the blessing of the government, this religious organization has grown in its presence and its witness in ways that were just amazing, that we don't hear much about in our Western world. We only hear about a China that I would say is a few years older. We don't hear too much about where the progression is at this time.
So it sounds like there's really been a lot of development in terms of the way that the church is living out its call at this time, at least. I wonder too, though, I've heard it mentioned a couple of different times that that the Chinese church is sort of in a first-generation church kind of phase. What are some of the ways that that there are some distinctly Chinese Christian expressions of faith? What, you know, is there has there been much work done around their identity as Christians who are Chinese?
This is a big conversation in the seminaries and Bible schools. And one of their concerns is to get scholars who are Chinese, who have been raised in China, to be able to study elsewhere, but then come back and help to interpret that. They know that they need to address that sort of that indigenous, what's, you know, really the Chinese message of it. And they're not, as far as I could tell and what they said, they're just not there yet.
They're just beginning. The China Christian Council talked about having a committee that's formed and has some theologians coming together who are sort of working on their first volume of what they look at as a Chinese integrated theology. And so I think that's the dream that they want to claim.
Yeah. It's kind of curious because we, in our culture, are trying to de-Westernize Christianity and broaden the base. And we keep saying to them, what's the Chinese contribution? And essentially they're saying, wait about 10 years and we'll get it. So that some of the Bible schools and seminaries are sending their faculty out of China to Western universities to get the basics so they can go back. But it will be absorbed into the Chinese culture soon. But again, I guess one of the concerns was that are they adopting a Western version of Christianity for a multitude of reasons, some of which are more social or economic than theological.
So I understand that you brought something to share with us. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it, this scroll here.
Well, the church in Beijing that we visited on a Sunday morning gave us this banner, which translated is that God loves all the people. And this was something that was very important for them to be sure we had, and it'll be on display in our church at the Chicago Temple, but also available to anybody else who wants to use it. But it is one of their proclamations that is simple and yet at the heart of what they understand to be their message to their culture.
Why do you think that that it was important for? Why do you think that this was the particular message that was most important?
I'm guessing that it's again, it is universal and it's not exclusive to Christianity in effect. That you know, if God loves all the people, then that means all the people. And it's a very, very mixed culture. As we have discovered, Christians are a very, very small percentage of the population. Thank
you, Bishop Dick, Reverend Blackwell, Reverend Christofferson, for the work that you have done on behalf of the church here in the U.S. In partnering with the church in China. I'm Emily McGinley for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.